All right, so in a couple of recent interviews, Deontay Wilder has talked about Eddie Hearn, Anthony Joshua, and he said that he feels that Hearn doesn't want Deontay Wilder to face Anthony Joshua, but the fight is inevitable next year. And, if the Saudis are putting the money up, they probably will fight. But he's also talked about Joshua, not being born a champion, that he was manufactured, and, that Deontay Wilder, he's a true champ in the sense. And you're like, what? And his fans will turn around and say, well, Wilder, he wasn't protected by anyone, his resume speaks volume, and Joshua, who has he done? It's like, well, Joshua wasn't protected. He wasn't. He took on tough tasks. He actually tried to do what Tyson Fury claims to be doing, which is, trying to make the big fights, he fought whoever he could. Even when fights fell apart, he was looking for a decent contender to fight in his place. That's why I said I'm going to do not quite a kind of WTF kind of video on Deontay Wilder or Joshua, either one of them, not so much that. But let's just look through and do a bit of a dive into both guys' resumes and just see who is right. Was Deontay Wilder, was he really protected by PBC? Did he fight the best available opponents at the time? And the same with Anthony Joshua. Well, if we look at their pro careers, there is a big difference in the number of fights they had, right? Well, Deontay Wilder turned pro in November 2008. Anthony Joshua turned pro in October 2013. So there's about a 5-year difference between one starting their pro career to another, okay? Neither guys were particularly experienced as amateurs, although Wilder won the bronze medal in 2008 and Anthony Joshua won the gold in London 2012. Neither guys had particularly massive amateur backgrounds. They both entered the sport late bloomers in the sport, but they were able to pick it up fairly quick. Deontay Wilder obviously turned pro after the Olympics in 2008. Ethan Cox, Shannon Gray, Robbie Green Jr. These are the guys he's fighting. And Shannon Gray, to his credit, went in 1-0 and never fought again after that. That's the only fight where you could look at and be like, okay, well, that guy had at least no losses. The rest of them all had losses. You look through this record and you're looking and you're like, who are these guys? The Dustin Nichols fight, which was in July of 2010, that's a fight that people love to bring up. Now, people love to bring that one up because that Dustin Nichols guy, who was 4-2 going into the fight, right? And this guy was absolutely 400 pounds. He was massive in there. That fight right there, people love to bring that up because they say that Deontay Wilder was dropped in it. He wasn't dropped in that fight. He did touch down, but you look at that fight, that was Wilder tripping over himself. That wasn't because Dustin Nichols and Dick Nichols dropped him or anything like that. That was Deontay Wilder's just footwork not being the best and going down. So I wouldn't call that a knockdown. However, 2 fights later in October, he fought a guy called Harold Sconis. Now, Richard Schaefer was the promoter of this fight. Seth Mitchell was on the card as well. Seth Mitchell was an American prospect from the early 2010s. No chin. Lost to Chris Arreola, lost to Jonathan Banks by knockout. Did avenge that defeat, to be fair, but he had absolutely no chin. Wilder fought on this card. He was 217 and it was against Harold Sconis. Now, you look at this on BoxRec, it says Sconis was down 4 times. Yeah, stopped in 4 rounds. But it says Wilder was down once. Now, at the time of recording this, as far as I'm aware, there's still no footage of that knockdown. That knockdown, because apparently it was recorded, wiped from the records. Now, there was a lot of rumours about that knockdown. I heard several people, and you could see them on forums across the internet going back a couple of years, where people who witnessed it, some said that Wilder was in an awful lot of trouble and that, the referee kind of gave him the benefit, they gave him a long count. Other people said actually that it was a bit like the Dustin Nichols knockdown, in a sense of Wilder was just completely off balance. He doesn't have the best footwork even now. It's something that's never really been improved by him. And he just toppled over more so. It was called a knockdown. Lately, over the last few years, the claim that it was a more severe knockdown, he was legitimately hurt and he was lucky to get through it, that tends to be the one that's kind of a lot more people believe. And for me, if there is footage of it and it was just a clumsy, feet getting tangled together and, maybe coming down, not really a knockdown, why is there no footage of it? If it was something like that you could look at and be like, that's clearly not a knockdown. Anyone could look at it and be like, that's clearly not a knockdown. Why do we not see footage of it? And again, this was Deontay Wilder. This is all he was doing. He was fighting absolute nobodies. That was in his 13th professional fight. All right. So again, you go and you look at this resume. It was really only when he fought, where's the guy? Kelvin Price in December of 2012. That's the only guy who really kind of had a bit of name. Well, I wouldn't even say name value, but you look at and think, okay, two undefeated American prospects meeting. This was 4 years after he turned pro, right? That was on the undercard of Amir Khan versus Carlos Molina. Leo Santa Cruz, Sean Porter, who else? Errol Spence, Jojo Diaz all fought on that card. Marcus Brown fought on that card. Alfredo Angulo fought on that card. That was on Showtime. A lot of names for the future. Were on that card. And Deontay Wilder was 25-0. Calvin Price, I remember there was people at the time picking Calvin Price to win that fight. Wilder knocked him out in 3 rounds. Very dull affair. It was a very dull affair. There wasn't much happening. Deontay Wilder, very low punch output, then found the right hand in the 3rd round. That was it. It was all she wrote. But that was really his first real proper step up. Because again, you look at this, you David Long, who else do you have? Owen Beck, Damon McCreary, who was undefeated going into that fight. I think McCreary was that's the guy. He was actually starting his career as a super middleweight. And he was 262 pounds, 100 pounds heavier than he was at super middleweight when he started his career against Deontay Wilder. He was unbeaten, but that was unbeaten in he was never going to win that fight. And again, another cream puff. Then Wilder fights Matthew Gear. He fights Audley Harrison. I'm not sure, was that Harrison's last fight? Again, that was on the undercard of an Amir Khan fight. Wilder was working with Golden Boy for a bit in his career before he ended up going with PBC, and he ended up fighting on the undercard of Amir Khan versus Julio Diaz. I remember that fight well. Amir Khan was dropped. Dave Allen fought on the undercard. Anthony Ogogo fought on that card. Terry Flanagan, Gary Sykes, people like that, they were all fighting on that card. That was over in Sheffield, and that was Deontay Wilder. That was another kind of quote-unquote step up. Then he fought Sergey Lukovic. Many of you remember that fight. Lukovic was spasming on the canvas. Former heavyweight champion was Sergey Lukovic, but really, he was just... Sergey Lukovic, the fact he was able to pick up a title, I believe he was WBO champion. I think that's who Shannon Briggs beat for his title. The fact that he was able to win a title, a version of the heavyweight title, shows how bad the heavyweight division was in the early 2000s. I mean, you had Klitschko and then you had nobody. Sergey Lukovic, a prime Sergey Lukovic, would probably be... Would he even break into the top 20 at heavyweight the way we have it now? You'd struggle. Seriously, he would struggle to probably get into the top 20 at heavyweight now, because he was never a particularly good fighter. And then in his next fight, he fights Nikolai Furta, stops him in 4 rounds. I think that was the fight where he busted his face up pretty bad and then stopped him with a big right hand. That was in October of 2013, the 26th of October. What fight was that for Deontay Wilder? That was on the undercard of Bernard Hopkins versus Caro Murad, I think is how you say it. Peter Quillen beat Gabe Rosado. Dominic Wade, who would eventually go on to face Triple G, fought on the undercard as well. That was Wilder's 30th pro fight. So by the time Wilder was having his 30th pro fight, Anthony Joshua was making his pro debut against Emmanuel Lee. That was on a Sky show. I'd like to tell you what one it was on. It was on the undercard of Scott Quigg versus Yolandas Salias, I think is how you say that name. That was a draw. Kevin Mitchell fought on the card. Lee Selby fought Ryan Walsh, Luke Campbell, Glenn Foote, people like that, and Wadi Camacho. That was Joshua's pro debut. All right, and that guy was unbeaten, but Joshua, he was handpicked. Now, Joshua didn't fight the greatest of opposition. That's fair to say. I won't turn around and say that beating Matt Legg, Konstantin Erish and Matt Skelton were achievements, but they were a damn sight a lot better than who Deontay Wilder was fighting in his first few fights. I can tell you that. Skelton, Michael Sprott, Konstantin Erish. See, Konstantin Erish was one of those journeymen, and he is a journeyman, but he was one of those journeymen who had very good punch power. Konstantin Erish, if you've ever seen him. So a lot more risks than, we'll say, Deontay Wilder was taking even earlier on in his career, by even putting them in with guys who have a bit of pop to him. Then he fights, obviously, Michael Sprott in the end of 2014, fights Jason Gavern in, this was a fight that Joshua alluded to, actually, as well. This was in Joshua's 11th pro fight. Now, Deontay Wilder fought Jason Gavern in 2014. That was his 32nd pro fight. They both fought Jason Gavern. Wilder fought him in August 2014. Joshua fought him in April 2015. That was Joshua's 11th pro fight. It was Wilder's 32nd. Right? By then, the best win on his resume was Malik Scott, who he beat in Puerto Rico. That was on the undercard of Danny Garcia versus Mauricio Herrera. A lot of controversy about that fight. It was a first round knockout for Wilder. There was a lot of controversy. Many people feel that Malik Scott took a dive. That was an eliminator for the WBC title. So put Deontay Wilder in line to challenge the then champion, Bermain Beware Stavern. Now, Stavern only had one loss going into that fight. And people at the time saw that as a really, really competitive fight. I remember at the time there was Ringside was still going, which was a show on Sky, where, you know, you'd get like Matthew Macklin, Johnny Nelson, I think Adam Smith would be on there as well. And they talk about, you know, some upcoming fights, you know, near and afar. And this was one that was being talked about. And I remember Matthew Macklin saying that the lack of rounds would catch up to Wilder in this fight. A lot of people felt Stavern would win. He didn't. He took an absolute Hail Mary beating in there. Got an absolute pasting for 12 rounds. Wilder won. He is now WBC heavyweight champion. But he was still seen as a contender, even by his team at the time. So there was no chance we were going to see him unified with Klitschko. We had to wait until June to see him fight Eric Molina in his first title defense. To be fair, he had a rapid title defense straight after against Johan Duhaupas. But again, Molina and Johan Duhaupas, these are guys who you would probably be saying, well, you know, if you're a prospect on the way up, you would probably be fighting these guys anyway. And then he fights Artur Szpilka, you know, so that's his first year of his title reign. He's fought Molina, Duhaupas and Szpilka. And you're thinking, okay, you've had 3 gimme fights, fair enough. If that's what you're going to do, you're going to have 3 gimme fights, fair enough. Who are you going to take on? To be fair, he was going to take his mandatory Povetkin on in May. That didn't happen. Povetkin failed the test. Okay, fine. Are you going to take on a contender of note? You know, someone who, you know, is decent. No, Chris Arreola, right? We'll leave it there with Wilder's resume for now. So Chris Arreola in July of 2016, he fights. And Arreola, who had retired prior to that fight, had come out of retirement to take this fight. He looked terrible. Wilder smashed his right hand to bits in that fight. But ultimately, it was going one way. Wilder got the stoppage. They had to pull Arreola out. His face was a mess. Right now, Joshua fought Gavern in 2015, right? Fought Zimbarno Love, who was a journeyman, and he's another one of those journeymen who, yeah, he's a journeyman, but he has a bit of pop there as well. You know, you want to be a bit careful with him. Interestingly, Rafael Zimbarno Love has been in there with the likes of Anthony Joshua. He's been in there with loads of them. Claims that Shannon Briggs, the hardest puncher he's been in there with. Just a little bit of trivia for you. Claims it was Shannon Briggs. I'd well believe it, because Briggs always had tremendous power. Tremendous power. Fights Kevin Johnson. At the time, Johnson had never been stopped. Johnson had seen better days, to be fair. Goes down and fights Gary Cornish. That was at the O2. Won the Commonwealth title. He was actually rated number 2 by the WBC after that fight. Undeserved, to be fair, looking at the resume he's fought, but nevertheless, rankings, promoters, stuff like that, you know how it goes. Then he fights Dylan White, who was unbeaten at the time. This is for British title, put his Commonwealth and WBC international title on the line. He goes in there, he stops Dylan White in 7 rounds in a very, very tough competitive fight. Now, at that time, the boxing landscape was changing. 2 weeks prior, Tyson Fury had dethroned long-reigning champion Vladimir Klitschko, so it meant that the titles were now with Tyson Fury. But as soon as he won it, the IBF stripped him, I should say, of his title because he had to fight Klitschko in a rematch. Mandatory challenger Vyacheslav Glasov was waiting. He fought Charles Martin for the vacant title. Charles Martin won. That was on the undercard of Deontay Wilder versus Artur Szpilka, by the way, for those wondering. Charles Martin wins. Instantly put in with a fight against Anthony Joshua, right? Maybe was it too much too soon? With hindsight, you could say it probably was. But Joshua goes in there against Charles Martin, gets the job done in 2 rounds, picks up his title. Charles Martin was happy to pick up that paycheck. So, Joshua takes a bit of a gimme fight against an undefeated opponent. To be fair, Dominic Brazil, not really much known about him. We know a lot more about Brazil now. That was always going to be easy for Joshua, and it was. Then he fights Eric Molina. Now, that was a fight that really, for a lot of us, we were like, come on. Because they were teasing Klitschko at the time. We got Molina. That was a bit of a, come on. Molina, of all people. He went in there, did what he needed to do. In the ring after that fight, what did Eddie Hearn announce? Wembley Stadium, April 2017, Vladimir Klitschko, Anthony Joshua. Joshua hadn't even been professional 3 years. Hadn't even been professional 3 years. He'd only been champion for a year, and he's fighting Vladimir Klitschko. By that stage, Wilder had been champion for a little over 2 years, and he was still fighting the likes of Chris Arreola. He was looking to take on, well, actually, let's just talk more about this, right? So, he'd no mandatory. So he was meant to fight a guy, I can't remember his name, Andre Warzak or something like that his name was. I think he was Austrian. He was a fairly run-of-the-mill obscure heavyweight who had only had one loss, which was to Alexander Povetkin in a couple of rounds a couple of years prior. But guess what? He failed the PED test. All right. So they had to put someone in. They put him in there with Gerald Washington. And then he beats Gerald Washington. He has to make a mandatory defence against Bermane Stiverne. So literally after nearly 3 years, he's back to where he started fighting Bermane Stiverne, during which time Joshua has fought Vladimir Klitschko. And so people could say, Klitschko was still useful. And he was winning the fight. Joshua was able to get the stoppage. Then he has to make a mandatory defence, Anthony Joshua himself, against Kubrat Pulev. Kubrat Pulev is a more dangerous mandatory than Bermane Stiverne at that time, and he'd done more to earn it, to be fair. He'd beaten the likes of Derek Chisora. Bermane Stiverne had fought once since then, and that was against Derek Rossi, a well-known journeyman on the American scene, but that's it. In a fight in which he was dropped and laboured to a decision. Hadn't even fought a 12-round bout since the Deontay Wilder loss, but found himself mandatory. Kubrat Pulev ended up pulling out of the fight on fight week, replaced by Carlos Takam, who at the time had only got 3 losses. Short notice job, but to be fair, a short notice job with Carlos Takam as the opponent is better than an opponent failing the PED test in 2016 and then drafting in someone like a Gerald Washington with plenty of time to know, but still drafting him in as an opponent nonetheless. And then he gets rid of Carlos Takam, goes into a unification fight against then WBO heavyweight champion Joseph Parker. This is less than 2 years after he's won the title. He's already unifying. By 2018, Wilder had been champion for 3 years, no unifications in sights. Had beaten Bermane Stiverne. To be fair, the original opponent meant to be Luis Ortiz. He ended up, I think it was actually an adverse finder or something? I don't know if he necessarily failed, but it was something. Anyway, he goes and fights Ortiz nevertheless in April of 2018. March of 2018, gets the win in the 10th round. And people acted like Luis Ortiz was this amazing, that trumped anything Joshua did. Joshua had beaten Carlos Takam, Joshua had beaten Vladimir Klitschko, and Joshua would go on in the next couple of weeks to beat Joseph Parker, right? Luis Ortiz's best win is Brian Jennings, or an ancient Tony Thompson. Really take your pick who you think is better out of the two. They're probably his best wins. You could probably maybe say, because now he's beaten Charles Martin, because Charles Martin, former heavyweight champion, would you maybe even say that's Luis Ortiz? Has that win aged with time? Not really. If anything, it's got worse with time. And then anyway, Deontay Wilder announces in the summer, actually on the 21st of September, because it was on the exact same day that Anthony Joshua took on mandatory with the WBA, Alexander Povetkin, 22nd of September, correction off by a day. But he fought Povetkin, only had one loss. Actually was a very good performance by Joshua. I know we got rocked early on, Povetkin was having a success, but if you look at the performance as a whole, that wasn't a bad performance by Anthony Joshua, to be fair. Deontay Wilder takes on Tyson Fury in December the 1st, 2018. Tyson Fury, former heavyweight champion of the world, had been stripped of all those titles after having, an episode, let's call it that, going a bit off the rails. Also had failed tests. We have to remember about that. Obviously, they happened. They did happen. As much as Fury fans like to forget, they happened, right? 2 as far as I believe. One for that Nandrolone and the other for the old how you doing. So He'd been stripped of all those titles. He'd come back. He had 2 comeback fights. Hadn't looked particularly amazing. Deontay Wilder was like, yep, I will have that. Goes in there against Tyson Fury. Draw. Many people feel Fury won the fight. People claim that Fury got a long count and that he was down for longer than 10 seconds. Where is this notion that it's a count of 10, not 10 seconds? A count of 10, not 10 seconds. But somehow, because Fury was down for 10 seconds, longer than 10 seconds, it means it's the referee's count is final. It's not a count of 10 seconds. And I'll talk about that fight more in a wee bit, right? Because there's a few other things that came out over a year after, well, that the Deontay Wilder fans are claiming came out over a year after, which they only started talking about when they were basically debunked. We'll talk about that more in a wee bit. But Wilder has to make a mandatory defense of his title, fights Dominic Breazeale, knocks him out in a round, to be expected. Does a better job on him than Anthony Joshua does. And actually, that was in May of 2019. Anthony Joshua, going into 2019, was looking to fight Dillian Whyte. They were looking to do a rematch in Wembley Stadium in April. The fight never came to fruition, so he got a date instead for June. This was going to be a fortnight after Wilder had just knocked out Breazeale. And Joshua, by his own admission, was like, I didn't want Wilder to do a better job than I did. He did, so now I'm going to perform. Joshua was meant to be fighting Jarrell Miller. We had the press conference. We still have never seen the gloves are off. I'd love to see it. Maybe when Joshua retires, he will upload it. I do believe he owns the footage, so hopefully we can see it someday. But Miller failed. Multiple tests. Had loads of stuff in him. So they have to draft in an opponent. Now, on a short notice job like that, when you're trying to save a show, do you expect the opponent is going to be good? We were hearing names like Michael Hunter. We were hearing names like Luis Ortiz, who actually did refuse the offer. We were hearing names like Adam Kalnacki, who at the time was unbeaten. They're not bad names at all. Ends up, they get Andy Ruiz. Again, not a bad name at all. Only loss came against Joseph Parker in a world title fight. Many people feel that he won the fight. He'd only just fought a couple of weeks prior against Demetrenko, so at least he was, not being plucked off the couch to come in and fight Joshua. He goes in there and he beats Anthony Joshua. Stops him in 7 rounds. Everyone loses their mind. Ruiz, talent, but it was a real kind of, we did not expect that. Joshua didn't look right at all in that fight. Goes and invokes the rematch clause and beats Andy Ruiz. The first time we really see an event in Saudi Arabia. We've come to see many, many more since then. Deontay Wilder, in the meantime, goes and rematches Luis Ortiz again in November of 2019. Don't really understand. None of us really did, but he goes and rematches Luis Ortiz, knocks him out in 7 rounds. And then we get the rematch announced with Tyson Fury. It's going to be the first big fight of 2020, but early enough in the year. He goes in there against Tyson Fury. There was a lot of people picking Deontay Wilder. We all expected a competitive fight. It wasn't. Fury dominated Deontay Wilder. So people like to bring up the fact that, Fury, Wilder has Fury. Yeah, we never beat Fury. Fury's always either beaten him or it was a draw. Fury goes and beats Deontay Wilder. They claim that Fury had tampered gloves. They show a picture of the glove looking deformed from the first fight, which happened over a year before. Make that make sense. But they were claiming that was the glove he was wearing in the rematch until they were proven wrong. And then they were saying they were both deformed. They were both faulty. Yeah, really. We don't hear from Wilder for a little over a year. We hear from him later on that year, saying that Fury cheated, all this nonsense. They end up fighting in 2021, and again, repeat. Deontay Wilder gets knocked out. He ends up fighting Robert Helenius 2022, gets the first round knockout win. Now he's fighting Joseph Parker on the Day of Reckoning card. Anthony Joshua, on the other hand, has only one fight in 2020. Fights Kubrat Pulev, who was his mandatory with the IBF. He then has a mandatory with the WBO he has to fulfill because obviously the Fury fight scuppered the arbitration rule that Fury had to fight Deontay Wilder. So he goes in there with mandatory challenger Alexander Usyk. Could have vacated, but didn't. Fought Alexander Usyk. He lost. He invoked they tried to do Fury versus Usyk. He was talking about taking step aside, be willing to do it. When that didn't happen, obviously they had to do the rematch. He loses again, right? He lost to Alexander Usyk twice. Both guys have lost to one guy twice. Fury for Wilder, Usyk for Joshua. Both guys, Fury and Usyk, are fighting. One of them can say they're claiming to be the best in the division. No shame in losing to either. But then Joshua has 2 comeback fights, one against Jermaine Franklin, only lost prior to that was against Dylan White, wins a 12-round decision over him, and then knocks out late replacement Robert Helenius in the 7th round. Now he's fighting Otto Wallin. You look at that resume and we talk about it there. A year after winning his world title, he's in with Klitschko. A following year, he's unifying and he's fighting mandatories like Carlos Takam and Alexander Povetkin. A year after winning Wilder's world title, he is fighting Artur Spilka. The following year, he is fighting Gerald Washington. The following year, he's fighting Bermane Stiverne. It took, right, from January 17, 2015, when he won that title, up until December 2018. What's that, nearly 4 years later? To fight Tyson Fury, who at the time was not the Fury who we have today, or we'd see it against Klitschko. It was a Fury who'd lost over 100 pounds of weight, coming back from God knows what. That was the first meaningful fight, if you don't want to count Luis Ortiz. And even if you want to count Luis Ortiz, that's 3 years later. But somehow Joshua was protected. I think that look at both guys' resumes, comparatively speaking, tells you all you need to know. Now, I thought about doing a complete WTF for Deontay Wilder. I may very well do it, depending on what happens in the fight against Joseph Parker. But for now, I'll let the fans in the comments, I'll let the viewers, I'll let them decide. That's their resumes. Where was Joshua protected? I'll leave it there. Hope you enjoyed it, people. Smash the like button if you could. Hit subscribe, of course, if you haven't already. I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.